Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 9 true disturbing stories from rural Kentucky. These are tales of people who ventured into isolated hollows, forgotten trails, and abandoned homesteads, and found something they were never meant to see. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Story 1. There's a hiking trail that runs along the eastern ridge above Harlan County that most people don't know exists anymore. It used to be marked on old Forest Service maps from the 70s, but sometime in the early 80s they stopped maintaining it. My grandmother told me about it when I was maybe 16 or 17, mentioned it in this offhand way like she was trying to decide whether she should even bring it up. She said her brother used to hunt up there before he died, said the hollow below the trail was deep enough that you couldn't see the bottom even at noon on a summer day. I'm Rebecca Hartwell, and I was 24 when I decided to find that trail. I'd been feeling restless that whole spring, working at the pharmacy in town and living in the same apartment I'd had since college. My lease was almost up. I remember that specifically because I'd been putting off the decision about whether to renew, and I think part of me wanted an excuse to clear my head for a day. The trailhead wasn't hard to find once I knew roughly where to look. There was an old parking area, really just a widened shoulder where the asphalt had crumbled into gravel, and a gap in the tree line that might have been an entrance once. No sign, no marker, just trees pressing in and that sense of weight you get sometimes in Kentucky woods, like the air is thicker under all that green. I started walking a little after 8 in the morning. The temperature was probably in the mid-60s, comfortable, and I'd brought a water bottle and some trail mix in a little backpack that had a broken zipper I kept meaning to replace. The path was still visible if you paid attention, just overgrown with ferns and moss in places where the canopy got especially thick. For the first hour or so, everything felt normal. I saw a deer once, just a flash of brown moving through the undergrowth maybe 20 yards off the trail. Heard woodpeckers. The usual stuff. I wasn't thinking about my grandmother's story, really. I was thinking about whether I wanted to stay in Harlan County or maybe try moving to Lexington, whether that would feel like giving up or growing up. The trail started descending around 9:30, maybe 10. I'd check my phone occasionally even though I didn't have service, just to see the time. The trees got older as I went down, thicker trunks, more space between them. The hollow my grandmother mentioned was somewhere off to my left, I thought. Or maybe my right. The topography got confusing once I was in the middle of it. That's when I started noticing the quiet. It wasn't gradual. One moment I could hear birds and insects and leaves rustling, and then it was just my footsteps and my breathing. I stopped walking and stood there for a minute, trying to figure out what had changed. The temperature had dropped too, I realized. Not dramatically, but enough that I could feel it on my arms. I told myself it was just a weather shift, maybe a cloud passing over. But when I looked up through the canopy, the sky was still that bright washed-out blue it had been all morning. I kept walking. What else was I going to do? The trail continued down, winding between these massive oaks that had to be 100 years old, maybe more. I started seeing rocks that looked like they'd been stacked at some point, just piles of flat stones on either side of the path. Could have been trail markers from decades ago. Could have been natural, I didn't know. Then I heard my grandmother's voice. It came from somewhere off the trail to my left, distant but clear. She was saying my name. Rebecca. Just my name, in the exact tone she used when she wanted my attention but wasn't upset. I froze mid-step. My grandmother had died 3 years earlier. I stood there and felt my pulse in my throat, in my wrists. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was wind moving through trees in a weird way, making a sound that resembled speech. Maybe I was more tired than I thought. Maybe I was projecting because I'd been thinking about her story. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew what I'd heard. Rebecca. There it was again. Same direction, same distance, same exact inflection. I started walking again, faster now, keeping my eyes on the trail ahead. My mouth had gone dry, that metallic taste you get when adrenaline hits. I wasn't scared yet exactly, but I wasn't comfortable either. The rational part of my brain was trying to stay in control, listing explanations. But there was another part that wanted me to turn around and climb back up to the parking area. The voice called again a few minutes later. Still my grandmother, still saying my name, but this time it was closer. Maybe 30 feet away instead of 50. I didn't look toward it. I just kept walking, watching where I put my feet, trying to focus on the physical act of moving forward. Then I heard myself. It was my voice, coming from somewhere ahead of me on the trail, calling back. Grandma. I stopped so suddenly I almost fell. The sound was perfect, identical to my voice, the exact questioning tone I might have used. It was coming from around the next bend in the trail, maybe 40 or 50 yards ahead. My hands were shaking. I could feel sweat gathering at my hairline even though the air was cold now, cold enough that I could see my breath. Something was very wrong here, and I'd known it for the last 10 minutes but hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. Now I couldn't avoid it. I heard my grandmother's voice again, from behind me now much closer. Come here, sweetie. And my own voice from ahead responding, where are you? They were having a conversation. They were mimicking both of us, calling back and forth along the trail with me standing frozen between them. I didn't make a decision to run. My body just started moving, scrambling off the trail to my right, away from both voices, pushing through ferns and over fallen logs. I could hear myself crashing through the undergrowth, loud and clumsy, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from the trail, away from those voices. I ran for maybe 2 minutes before my foot caught on a root and I went down hard, landing on my hands and knees in a patch of dead leaves. I stayed there, breathing hard, listening. The woods were completely silent, not even wind, not even the sound of my own movement settling. Just nothing, like someone had wrapped the entire forest in cotton. Then from directly behind me, maybe 5 feet away, I heard my grandmother's voice say, "Why are you running, Rebecca?" I didn't look back, I couldn't. I pushed myself up and started running again, angling uphill now, trying to find the ridge, trying to get out of the hollow. Branches whipped across my face and caught in my hair. I tripped twice more but kept moving, kept climbing. My own voice followed me. I could hear it moving through the trees parallel to my path, keeping pace. It was saying things I might have said, asking questions. Where's the trail? I'm lost. Grandma, where are you? I don't know how long I ran. Time felt strange, stretched out and compressed at the same time. The slope got steeper and I used tree trunks to pull myself up, my legs burning, my lungs aching. At some point I realized I'd dropped my backpack. I didn't remember dropping it. The voices faded as I climbed. Gradually, in stages. First my own voice going quiet, and then my grandmother's dropping away, until there was just the sound of my breathing, and my hands grabbing bark and my boots scrambling for purchase on the steep ground. I found the trail again by accident, nearly walked past it before I recognized the old stone markers. I was much higher up than I thought I'd be, almost back to the ridge. I turned uphill and walked as fast as I could, not quite running but close. The silence broke somewhere around where I'd first noticed it. Birds started calling, insects humming, all the normal forest sounds flooding back in like someone had turned up a volume dial. The temperature rose. By the time I reached the parking area, I was sweating in my long sleeves. My car was exactly where I'd left it. I got in and locked the doors and sat there for maybe 15 minutes before my hand stopped shaking enough to get the key in the ignition. I didn't renew my lease. I moved to Lexington 2 weeks later. Never told anyone why. Never went hiking alone again either, which probably seems like an overreaction to most people. But I know what I heard down in that hollow. The worst part came 3 days after the hike when I was packing up my apartment. I found my backpack hanging on the hook by my front door, right where I always kept it. The broken zipper was still broken. The water bottle was still inside, still half full. I know I dropped it in those woods. I felt it slip off my shoulders when I fell. But there it was, back in my apartment like it had never left. I threw it away that night. Took it straight to the dumpster behind the building and never touched it again. Story 2. My grandfather's cabin sat at the end of a logging road that hadn't been maintained in probably 30 years. When he died, my father inherited the property, and when my father died, it passed to me. I'm David Brennan, and I was 31 when I finally decided I should probably go see what kind of shape the place was in. I'd been out there exactly twice as a kid, both times in summer, both times brief visits where we didn't stay the night. The cabin was in Pike County, maybe 12 miles from the nearest paved road, tucked into a little clearing that my grandfather had carved out sometime in the 50s. The deed had been sitting in my filing cabinet for 2 years before I worked up the motivation to make the drive. It was late October when I went. The leaves were mostly down, and the temperature at night was dropping into the 30s. I told my girlfriend at the time, Shannon, that I was going to check on the property, maybe spend one night to see if the place was salvageable or if I should just sell the land and let someone else deal with the structure. She asked if I wanted company. I'd said no, told her it would be boring, just looking at an old building and probably cleaning out mouse nests. The drive took longer than I expected. The logging road was barely passable, full of ruts and washouts from rain. My truck bottomed out twice before I reached the clearing, and by the time I parked in front of the cabin, it was almost 4 in the afternoon. The building looked worse than I remembered. The roof sagged in the middle, and several of the windows had lost their glass, leaving dark gaps that looked like empty eye sockets. The porch had a hole in it big enough to lose a leg through, but the structure was still standing, which was more than I'd expected. I grabbed my overnight bag and my flashlight and walked up the porch steps carefully, testing each board before putting my weight on it. The front door was unlocked, swollen in its frame from moisture but not stuck. It opened with a scraping sound that echoed in the empty rooms inside. The interior was a mess. Leaves had blown in through the broken windows and piled in the corners. The furniture my grandfather had left was still there. A couch and a table and a wood stove, all covered in a thick layer of dust and bird droppings. The whole place smelled like mildew and rot and something else, something sharp and unpleasant that I couldn't quite identify. I spent an hour before dark just walking around, assessing the damage, taking photos on my phone even though I knew I wouldn't have service to send them until I drove back to civilization. The bedroom was in the best shape, surprisingly. The window had kept its glass, and the bed frame was still solid even if the mattress was obviously ruined. There was a crawlspace entrance in the bedroom closet, just a small wooden hatch in the floor that I noticed when I was checking to see if the closet rod would hold weight. I didn't open it. My grandfather had used the crawlspace for storage, I thought, but I wasn't interested in digging through boxes of old junk in the dark. I ate dinner from a can of soup I'd heated on my camping stove, sitting on the front porch and watching the sun go down through the trees. The light went fast once it started dropping, that quick twilight you get in mountain forests where the trees block the horizon. By 6:30, it was full dark. I went back inside and set up my sleeping bag on the bedroom floor, not trusting the old bed frame despite its apparent solidity. I'd brought a battery-powered lantern that cast a weak yellow glow around the room. The shadows in the corners seemed thicker than they should be, but I told myself that was just the unfamiliar space, my brain adjusting to the geometry. I tried to read for a while, a paperback I'd brought, but I couldn't concentrate. The cabin made noises as it settled, creaks and groans that sounded almost deliberate. Wind moved through the broken windows in the other rooms, creating a low whistling sound that would rise and fall in irregular patterns. I turned off the lantern around 10 and lay there in the dark, listening. That's when I heard the scratching. It was coming from below me from the crawlspace. A slow, methodical sound like something dragging across wood. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. A raccoon, maybe, or a possum. Something that had made a den under the cabin. The scratching moved. It traveled from one side of the room to the other, always staying directly beneath where I was lying. When I shifted position, it shifted with me. I turned the lantern back on with hands that weren't quite steady. The bedroom looked the same as before, empty and dusty, the closet door standing open about 6 inches. I stared at the closet, at the darkness beyond that gap, and tried to decide if I was being paranoid. The scratching had stopped when I turned on the light. I sat up in my sleeping bag and pulled my boots on, not bothering to lace them. If I was going to be awake all night freaking out about animal sounds, I might as well be ready to move. I kept the lantern on, pointing it at the closet door. Nothing happened for maybe 20 minutes. I started to relax, started to think about lying back down. Then I heard something else. There was a sound from the crawlspace like wood scraping on wood. The hatch. Something was pushing on the hatch cover from below. I watched the closet door. I couldn't see the floor of the closet from where I sat, couldn't see the hatch itself, but I could hear it. A steady pressure, the wood groaning as something tested its weight. The hatch cover shifted. I heard it slide a few inches across the closet floor. I grabbed the lantern and stood up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to get out of the cabin, but the bedroom door was on the far side of the room, past the closet, and I couldn't make myself walk toward it. The hatch cover slid a few more inches. Now there was a gap, a dark space maybe 6 inches wide where something could fit through. I saw fingers. They came through the gap slowly, pale and impossibly long, each one extending until the first knuckle bent at an angle that wasn't quite right. There were too many joints, I realized. Each finger had an extra knuckle, an extra segment, and they moved in a way that made my stomach clench. The fingers stretched across the closet floor, feeling along the wood, searching. The hand they belonged to was still below, out of sight, but I could see the arm now, thin and white, pushing up through the gap. I ran. I don't remember the decision to move. One moment I was standing there frozen, watching those fingers spread across the closet floor, and the next I was out the bedroom door, sprinting through the main room of the cabin, hitting the front door with my shoulder and nearly falling down the porch steps. I made it to my truck and got inside, fumbling with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I dropped them twice before I got the right key into the ignition. The engine started on the first try, and I reversed down that logging road without turning around, just watching the cabin recede in my headlights until the trees swallowed it. I didn't stop driving until I hit the paved road. Then I pulled over and sat there with the engine running, breathing hard, trying to convince myself I'd panicked over nothing. But I knew what I'd seen. Those fingers, those impossible joints. The way they'd moved across the floor like they were tasting the air, searching for me. I never went back. I had a real estate agent list the property 2 months later, sold it to someone sight unseen for less than the land was worth. I didn't tell them about the crawl space. I didn't tell them about anything. The sale closed in January. I got a call 3 weeks later from the Pike County Sheriff's Department asking if I knew anything about the property's history. Apparently, the new owner had gone out to survey the land and found the cabin burned to the ground. Fire department said it looked like arson, but there was no evidence of forced entry, no sign of anyone having been there recently. I told them I didn't know anything. Told them the cabin was standing the last time I saw it, which was technically true. They never called back. But sometimes I think about those fingers, about that pale arm pushing up through the hatch. I wonder if whatever was under that cabin is still there, under the ashes. I wonder if burning the place down was enough, or if you can't really destroy something like that with just fire. I try not to think about it too much. A story 3. I was 28 when my cousin Tyler convinced me we should go hiking way out near Fox Hollow. Neither of us had been out that far into the backcountry, even though we'd grown up in Breathitt County and spent half our childhood exploring every creek and ridge within 10 miles of town. Fox Hollow was different, though. It was 30 miles from anywhere, accessible only by old Forest Service roads that were mostly overgrown, and everyone in our county knew the stories. My name's Marcus Knox, and I should probably mention that I don't believe in supernatural stuff. I didn't then anyway. Tyler was more open to it, always reading about cryptids and watching those ghost hunting shows, but he approached it like a hobby, not a religion. When he proposed the trip, it was because he wanted to see the hollow for himself, wanted to either debunk the stories or maybe get some interesting footage for a YouTube channel he'd been thinking about starting. We left on a Friday morning in June, planning to hike in about 8 miles, camp for one night and hike out Saturday. The weather was good, low 80s with clear skies, and we both had the weekend off from work. Tyler worked construction and I was managing a hardware store at the time, so we didn't get many opportunities to do stuff like this together. The trail was barely visible for the first few miles, more of a suggestion than an actual path. We followed an old fire break that cut through the forest, using GPS on Tyler's phone to make sure we were heading in the right direction. The trees were thick, mostly oak and hickory, and the undergrowth was dense enough that we couldn't see more than 20 or 30 feet in any direction. Around noon, we stopped for lunch near a creek that probably didn't have a name. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones that looked like they'd been polished by centuries of current. Tyler filled our water bottles while I ate a sandwich that had gotten compressed into a flat square in my backpack. "You ever hear the story about the survey crew?" Tyler asked, screwing the cap back onto his water bottle. I had, but I let him tell it anyway. Back in the 90s, a Forest Service survey crew had gone into Fox Hollow to mark boundaries or catalog trees or something like that. Official business. They'd been out there for 3 days before someone radioed in saying they were seeing things in the woods, figures moving between the trees. The crew lead had told them it was probably just deer, told them to focus on the work. But the reports kept coming, and on the 4th day, the entire crew hiked out early, refusing to stay another night. The official report mentioned environmental stress and wildlife encounters, but the guys who'd been on that crew apparently told a different story at the bar. They said something had been following them, something that looked almost human but moved wrong, like its joints bent in directions they shouldn't. "You think that actually happened?" I asked, even though I didn't. Tyler shrugged. "I think something happened. Whether it was what they said or just a bunch of guys psyching each other out, I don't know." We kept hiking. The terrain got rougher as we went deeper, more elevation changes, more deadfall blocking the old fire break. At one point, we had to climb over a massive oak that had fallen across our path, its trunk easily 5 feet in diameter. The bark was covered in fungus, and the wood underneath had gone soft, crumbling under our weight. We found a good spot to camp around 4 in the afternoon. A little clearing maybe 40 feet across with relatively flat ground, and a fire ring someone had built out of stones years ago. The clearing was surrounded by dense forest on all sides, trees pressing in close enough that standing in the center felt like being at the bottom of a well. Tyler and I set up our tents on opposite sides of the clearing, then gathered firewood from the surrounding area. The sun was still up, but it would be dark in a few hours, and we wanted to have the fire going before we lost the light. That's when we started noticing things. Nothing dramatic at first, just little stuff that didn't quite make sense. Tyler found a tree about 30 yards from the clearing that had these marks carved into it, symbols that looked like they'd been made with a knife. Not initials or dates, just abstract designs that formed a pattern running up the trunk in a spiral. We'd both seen them in photos online, those symbols people find in the woods sometimes and argue about whether they're territorial markers or property boundaries or something else. Then I found the bones. They were hanging from a low branch maybe 20 feet from camp, strung on what looked like fishing line. Small bones, too small to be human, probably rabbit or squirrel. They'd been cleaned, bleached white by sun and weather, and they swayed slightly in the breeze even though I couldn't feel any wind. "Someone's been out here," Tyler said, stating the obvious. I agreed, but I couldn't figure out why someone would do that. Hunters sometimes left markers, but this didn't look like any marker I'd seen. It looked deliberate, arranged, intentional. We decided to stay anyway. It was getting late, and hiking out in the dark seemed worse than spending the night in a clearing where someone had left weird decorations. We built up the fire, cooked dinner, tried to relax. But both of us were on edge now, paying attention to the woods around us, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Full dark came around 9. The fire pushed back the shadows maybe 15 feet, and beyond that it was just blackness. Trees became silhouettes, indistinct shapes that could have been anything. Tyler heard it first. He held up his hand to stop me mid-sentence, and we both sat there listening. Footsteps, slow and measured, circling our camp at a distance. Not trying to be quiet, but not rushing either. Just walking, crunching through leaves and breaking twigs, staying just beyond the firelight. "Hey," Tyler called out. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped. We waited, both of us barely breathing, staring into the darkness. Nothing moved. The forest was completely silent, no insects, no birds, nothing. Then the footsteps started again, continuing their circle. They moved from our left to directly behind us, always staying at the same distance, always just out of sight. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, shining it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trunks and undergrowth, but I didn't see anyone. The footsteps didn't stop or change pace. They just kept circling, methodical and patient. Tyler was on his feet now too, his own flashlight out. We stood back to back near the fire, tracking the sound as it moved around us. Complete circuit, then another, then another. Whatever was making the sound didn't seem to care that we could hear it. After maybe 20 minutes, the footsteps stopped again. This time they didn't start back up. We stayed awake by the fire until almost 2 in the morning, feeding it logs, keeping it bright. Nothing else happened. No sounds, no movement. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and we took turns sleeping. One person keeping watch while the other dozed in their tent. I took the first watch. Tyler crawled into his tent around 2:30, and I sat by the fire, listening to the woods and trying not to imagine things in the darkness beyond the light. When it was Tyler's turn to watch around 5, he woke me up with an urgency in his voice that got me out of my sleeping bag instantly. "You need to see this," he said. I followed him to the edge of the clearing where the morning light was just starting to filter through the trees. He pointed into the woods, maybe 50 yards from our camp. There was another clearing there, almost identical to ours. Same size, same rough shape. And in the center of that clearing, there were 2 tents set up exactly like ours, on opposite sides, the same colors and brands. There was even a fire ring made of stones. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked like someone had recreated our campsite, positioned it to mirror ours, copied every detail down to which side each tent was on. "That wasn't there last night," Tyler said. His voice was shaking. I knew he was right. We walked all around this area gathering firewood. There was no way we'd missed an entire clearing with tents already set up. We didn't talk about what to do. We just started packing, moving fast, stuffing gear into our bags without bothering to organize it. I kicked dirt over the fire, scattering the coals, and Tyler was already pulling up tent stakes. We were packed and moving within 15 minutes, hiking back the way we'd come, not looking back at the clearing or at that impossible mirror campsite in the woods beyond it. The hike out took 6 hours. We pushed ourselves, barely stopping, not talking except to confirm directions. The forest felt different in daylight, less oppressive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was tracking our progress. We didn't see anything, though. No figures, no more symbols, no more bones. Just trees and undergrowth and the old fire break leading us back toward civilization. Tyler's truck was exactly where we'd left it, parked on an overgrown Forest Service road. We threw our gear in the bed and got in, and Tyler drove us back toward town without saying a word. It wasn't until we were almost home that I noticed something in my backpack's outer pocket. I pulled it out, not recognizing it at first. It was a small piece of white bone, drilled with a hole, like it had been part of that hanging decoration we'd found. I didn't remember picking it up. I hadn't touched those bones. Tyler saw it in my hand and pulled over. We looked at it together, this small piece of bone sitting in my palm, and neither of us said anything. I threw it out the window into the ditch beside the road. We never talked about Fox Hollow again. Tyler never started his YouTube channel, and neither of us go hiking anymore, not together, not alone. Some stories, I guess, are better left unconfirmed. Story 4. I'm Jessica Ramirez, and I was 29 when I took a contract surveying job in Harlan County. I'd been doing land surveying for about 5 years at that point, mostly residential properties and the occasional commercial development. But this was different. The county needed someone to walk old logging boundaries in preparation for a potential timber sale, which meant spending 3 days alone in the woods with nothing but a GPS unit, a notebook, and camping gear. The pay was good enough that I didn't ask too many questions. I should have. The logging territory they sent me to hadn't been active since the 60s. The roads in were mostly reclaimed by forest, and I had to hike the last 2 miles to reach the section they needed surveyed. My contact at the county office was this older guy named Randall, who gave me the coordinates and a rough map, and told me to radio in every evening to confirm I was okay. I set up my base camp on a ridge overlooking what used to be a logging operations site. You could still see evidence of it, old equipment rusting in the undergrowth, cable spools gone to rot, the scars in the earth where they'd dragged trees down to the road. But the forest had taken most of it back. In another 20 years, you probably wouldn't be able to tell humans had ever been there. The first day was routine. I walked the northern boundary, taking GPS coordinates every 100 feet, noting landmarks and changes in elevation. The weather was overcast but dry, temperature in the low 70s. I saw a deer, heard a hawk circling overhead, found a black snake sunning itself on a rock. Normal forest stuff. I made camp that evening, cooked some freeze-dried pasta on my camp stove, and radioed Randall to let him know I was fine. He sounded relieved to hear from me, which seemed like an odd reaction for what should have been a straightforward job. "You see anything unusual out there?" he asked. I told him no, just trees and old equipment. I asked why he was asking. There was a pause then. Last surveyor we sent out said the place felt wrong. Didn't finish the job. I asked what felt wrong meant, but Randall said he didn't know, just that the guy had hiked out on the second day and refused to go back. I thanked him for the information and signed off, trying not to let it bother me. The second day was when things started happening. I was working the eastern boundary, walking through an area where the trees grew closer together and the undergrowth was thick with ferns. I'd been at it for maybe 2 hours when I realized I could hear something moving parallel to my path, maybe 30 or 40 feet away through the trees. At first, I assumed it was a deer, but the sounds were too regular, too consistent. Deer move in bursts, stopping and starting. This was keeping pace with me, matching my speed exactly. I stopped walking and stood there listening. The sound stopped too. I took a few steps. The sounds resumed, staying the same distance away. I tried to tell myself it was an echo, some weird acoustic phenomenon in the forest, but I knew that didn't make sense. Sound doesn't work that way, doesn't stay locked to your position like that. I kept working, trying to ignore it, but knowing something was out there, tracking my movements, made it impossible to focus. I kept glancing to my right into the trees, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was following me. I never saw anything. Around noon, I stopped for lunch in a little clearing. I sat on a fallen log and ate a granola bar and tried to plan the rest of my day. The sounds had stopped when I stopped, and the forest was quiet, just wind moving through leaves overhead. That's when I looked down and saw the boot print. It was right in front of me, pressed into a patch of bare dirt maybe 3 feet away. A clear print, recent, the edges still sharp. Size and tread that looked almost exactly like my own boots. But the print was pointing away from me, away from where I was sitting. I stared at it, trying to understand. If I'd made that print, it should be pointing toward me or at least sideways. But this one was oriented like I'd been standing where I was now sitting and had walked away from my current position. I stood up slowly and looked around the clearing. There were other prints, I realized. A scattered trail of them, leading from where I'd entered the clearing to where I was now, but all of them backward, all of them pointing in the wrong direction. My mouth went dry. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest, in my ears, that pounding awareness that something was very wrong. I grabbed my gear and left the clearing, moving fast, not running but close. I didn't bother following my surveying route. I just headed west, toward the ridge where I'd made camp, using the GPS to guide me. The sounds in the trees resumed, still keeping pace, still staying the same distance away. But now they were on both sides of me, 2 sets of footsteps moving through the forest, matching my speed. I started running. The terrain was rough, full of deadfall and hidden holes, and I fell twice, scraping my hands on bark and rocks. But I kept moving, kept pushing uphill toward the ridge. The footsteps stayed with me, never getting closer but never falling behind. I burst into my campsite breathing hard, my legs shaking with exhaustion. The camp looked exactly like I'd left it, tent still standing, gear organized on the tarp I'd laid out, nothing disturbed. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. I stood there, listening, waiting for them to enter the camp. They didn't. Whatever was making them just stopped, like there was an invisible boundary they couldn't or wouldn't cross. I grabbed my radio and called Randall. Told him I needed to be pulled out, told him I wasn't finishing the survey. He didn't argue, just asked if I was hurt. I said no, I just needed to leave. He said he'd have someone at the trailhead by morning. I spent that night in my tent with a knife in my hand, listening. The footsteps started again around midnight, walking circles around my camp, staying just beyond where my campfire's light reached. Round and round for hours, that same measured pace. By the time dawn came, they'd stopped. The forest sounded normal again, birds singing, insects humming. I packed up fast and hiked out, and a Forest Service ranger was waiting at the trailhead like Randall had promised. He asked if I was okay. I said yes. He didn't ask why I'd left early, which made me think he already knew. I drove home that afternoon and emailed Randall to tell him I was done with the contract, wouldn't be coming back to finish the work. He replied within an hour, "Understood. Thanks for trying." That was it. No questions, no request for a report, no argument about the unfinished survey. 3 weeks later, I got a check in the mail for the full contract amount, even though I'd only completed maybe 40% of the work. There was no note, just the check and a form letter thanking me for my service. I deposited it and tried to forget about those 3 days in the woods. But sometimes when I'm working alone on a property survey, I'll hear something moving parallel to my path, matching my speed. And I have to stop and remind myself that I'm in a residential neighborhood or on a commercial lot, that there's nothing out there. Usually, the sounds stop after a minute or two. Usually. Story 5. My name is Aaron Westfield, and back when I was 32, I was part of this amateur paranormal investigation group. We weren't professionals, just 3 people with too much free time and a shared interest in supposedly haunted places. We'd go to abandoned buildings, old cemeteries, the usual spots, and we'd take photos and recordings and try to find evidence of something supernatural. We never did, which honestly was fine. It was more about the adventure than the destination. The 3rd member of our group, Sadie Porter, found the location. Old mining settlement in Leslie County, abandoned since the 40s when the mine collapsed and killed 11 workers. The buildings were still standing, mostly, and according to local stories, people who went out there at night reported seeing lights in the windows and hearing voices coming from empty rooms. Sadie was probably the most skeptical of the 3 of us. She was a high school science teacher, analytical by nature, always looking for the logical explanation. Our 3rd member, Greg Whitmore, was somewhere in the middle, open-minded but not gullible. We made a good team, I thought, balanced. We drove out on a Saturday in September, planning to spend the evening and night at the settlement, then drive back Sunday morning. The access road was worse than we'd expected, barely more than a trail, and Greg's SUV took a beating getting us there. By the time we parked at the edge of what used to be the settlement, it was late afternoon and the sun was already dropping toward the horizon. There were 5 buildings still standing. A main office structure, 2 bunkhouses, a mess hall, and something that might have been a storage shed or workshop. All of them were in bad shape, walls leaning, roofs partially collapsed, windows broken or missing. The forest was reclaiming everything, trees growing through floorboards, vines crawling up walls. We set up our equipment in the main office building. Temperature sensors, audio recorders, a couple of cameras pointed at different parts of the room. Greg had even brought one of those EMF readers that supposedly detect electromagnetic fields associated with supernatural activity. I'd never seen it register anything, but he insisted on bringing it every time. The plan was to document the space during daylight, then start our overnight investigation after dark. Standard procedure for us. We walked through each building, taking photos, making notes about structural integrity, looking for anything unusual. The bunkhouses were mostly empty, just rusted bed frames and rotted mattresses. The mess hall still had tables, long wooden things that had somehow survived decades of weather and neglect. The storage shed was full of old tools, mining equipment that I couldn't identify, everything covered in rust and bird droppings. Nothing seemed particularly unusual. No signs of recent occupation, no weird symbols or warnings. Just old buildings slowly falling apart. We ate dinner sitting on the steps of the main office as the sun went down. Sadie had brought sandwiches, and we ate them while watching the light fade from the sky, talking about what we expected to find. Greg thought we'd get some interesting audio, maybe voices or footsteps. Sadie thought we'd find nothing, like always. I didn't know what to expect. Full dark came around 7:30. We went back inside the office building and turned on our equipment, settled in to wait. The building had one large main room with a smaller office partitioned off in the back. We set up in the main room, sitting in a loose circle with our backs to the wall, flashlights off, letting our eyes adjust. For the first hour, nothing happened. We heard wind moving through the broken windows, the building settling, small animals moving in the walls. Normal stuff. Then the EMF reader went off. Greg had left it on the floor in the center of the room, and suddenly it was lighting up, the needle pegging to the highest reading. He grabbed his flashlight and went to check it, thinking maybe there was electrical wiring in the floor or something else that would explain the spike. The reading dropped to 0 as soon as he picked up the device. He set it back down, and after a few seconds it spiked again. We all watched it, not saying anything, trying to figure out what was causing the reaction. There was no pattern to it, just random spikes and drops, the needle jumping around like something was interfering with the device. Could be malfunction, Sadie said, but she didn't sound convinced. Then we heard the footsteps. They were coming from the smaller office in the back, slow and measured, like someone was walking across the wooden floor. We all heard them. There was no question about it, no ambiguity. Someone, something, was moving in that back room. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, my heart racing. Greg was already moving toward the back room, his own light out, Sadie right behind him. The footsteps stopped. We pushed open the door to the back office, shining our lights inside. The room was empty, just a desk and a chair and papers scattered across the floor. No one there, no way out except the door we just come through. Mice in the walls, Greg said, but even he didn't believe it. We went back to the main room. The EMF reader was still on the floor, still spiking and dropping randomly. We sat back down, none of us quite sure what to do next. That's when Sadie screamed. I turned to look at her, and she was staring at the window, at one of the broken windows that looked out toward the bunkhouses. Her face was white, her hand covering her mouth. "What?" I asked. She pointed. "Greg." I saw Greg in the window. Greg, who was sitting right next to me, said, "What are you talking about?" "Your face," Sadie said, her voice shaking. "In the window, you were looking in at us." The three of us stared at the window. There was nothing there now, just darkness and the vague shapes of trees beyond. "I'm right here," Greg said. "I know," Sadie said. "I know you are, but I saw you. Your face pressed against the glass looking in." We didn't talk for a minute, all of us trying to process what she was saying. Then I stood up and walked to the window, shining my flashlight outside. I could see the clearing, the other buildings, the trees, nothing else. "We should check the perimeter," I said, trying to sound calm. The three of us went outside, staying close together, flashlights cutting through the darkness. We walked around the office building, looking for signs that someone else was there, someone who might be messing with us. We didn't find anything. When we came back around to the front of the building, we all saw it at the same time. There was a figure standing in the doorway of one of the bunkhouses. just standing there, not moving, facing our direction. The distance was maybe 40 feet, and in the darkness I couldn't make out details. Just a silhouette, human-shaped, motionless. "Hey," Greg called out. "Who's there?" The figure didn't respond, didn't move. We started walking toward it, our flashlights pointed ahead. As we got closer, the figure stepped backward into the bunkhouse, disappearing into the darkness inside. We reached the doorway and stopped. The bunkhouse interior was pitch black, our lights only penetrating maybe 10 feet. I could see the bed frames we documented earlier, the rotted mattresses, but nothing else. "Come on," Greg said and stepped inside. Sadie and I followed. The bunkhouse was empty. We swept our lights across the entire space, checking every corner, every possible hiding spot. There was no one there. More importantly, there was no way out. The bunkhouse had only one door, the one we'd just come through, and all the windows were too high and too small for a person to fit through. "Where did they go?" Sadie whispered. None of us had an answer. We backed out of the bunkhouse, and that's when we heard Greg's voice calling from the direction of the office building. "Aaron, Sadie, where are you?" The three of us froze. Greg was standing right next to me, but his voice was coming from 40 feet away from the building we just left. "Aaron, Sadie, I can't find you." Greg, the real Greg standing next to me, opened his mouth to respond, and Sadie grabbed his arm, stopping him. "Don't," she said. We stood there in the darkness, listening to Greg's voice calling for us, sounding more and more panicked. It went on for maybe 2 minutes before it stopped abruptly, cut off mid-word. The silence that followed was absolute. "We need to leave," I said. "Right now." None of us argued. We walked quickly back to the SUV, not running but moving with purpose, our flashlights sweeping the darkness around us. We didn't look back at the buildings, didn't try to figure out what we just experienced. We just got in the vehicle and left. Greg drove us back down that terrible access road, taking turns too fast, bottoming out over ruts, neither Sadie nor I telling him to slow down. We just wanted to be away from that place, back to paved roads and streetlights and civilization. We didn't talk about what happened for the rest of the drive. When Greg dropped me off at my apartment around 3 in the morning, the only thing he said was, "We're done with this. The group. We're not doing this anymore." Sadie, sitting in the back seat, just nodded. I agreed. We never met up again, not as a group. I still see Greg occasionally around town, and we'll nod at each other, acknowledge that we know each other, but we never talk about that night. I haven't spoken to Sadie since. The equipment we left at the settlement, the cameras, the recorders, the EMF reader, we never went back for it. As far as I know, it's still there, collecting dust and rust in that abandoned office building. Sometimes I wonder what the recordings would have showed if we'd retrieved them, what the cameras might have captured. But mostly, I'm glad we didn't go back. I'm glad I don't know. Story 6. When my Aunt Patricia died, she left me her homestead in Letcher County. We hadn't been close, not really, but I was her only living relative, so the property came to me by default. I'm Hannah Kozlowski, and I was 35 when I drove out there to see what I'd inherited. The homestead was at the end of a gravel road that climbed halfway up a mountain. A small house built sometime in the 30s with a barn, and a few outbuildings scattered around the property. My aunt had lived there alone for 40 years, ever since her husband died, and she'd apparently never felt the need to update anything. No internet, no cable, just electricity and a phone line that probably went down every time it stormed. The house was locked when I arrived, but the lawyer who'd handled the estate had sent me keys. I let myself in and spent an hour just walking through the rooms, trying to get a sense of who my aunt had been. The place was neat, organized, everything in its place. Books lined the walls, mostly nature guides and local history. Photos in frames showed a younger version of my aunt, usually alone, sometimes with people I didn't recognize. In the bedroom, I found a journal on the nightstand. I almost didn't read it, felt like a violation, but curiosity won out. I flipped through the pages, scanning entries from the last few years of her life. Most of it was mundane. Notes about the garden, observations about weather, lists of things she needed from town. But the entries from the last 6 months were different. They mentioned things scratching at the walls at night, sounds on the roof, the barn door being open in the morning even though she'd locked it the night before. The final entry, dated 2 days before she died, just said, "It's inside now." I closed the journal and set it back on the nightstand, trying not to let it bother me. My aunt had been 83 when she died. Maybe she'd been confused, dealing with early dementia. Maybe she'd been hearing animals in the walls and let her imagination run wild. I decided to stay the night, partly because it was already late afternoon and partly because I wanted to prove to myself that the house was just a house, that there was nothing to be afraid of. I made dinner from supplies I'd brought, didn't trust whatever was in my aunt's pantry, and ate sitting at her kitchen table, looking out the window at the mountains beyond. The view was beautiful, I had to admit. Layers of ridges fading into blue distance, the whole world feeling vast and empty and peaceful. Darkness came early, the sun dropping behind the mountains around 7. I turned on lights throughout the house, not wanting to deal with shadows, and settled into the living room with a book I'd brought. The scratching started around 9. It was faint at first, just a soft sound like fingernails on wood, coming from the wall behind the couch where I was sitting. I turned to look at the wall, trying to pinpoint exactly where the sound was coming from. It stopped. I waited, listening. After a minute, it started again, same location, same soft scratching. I got up and walked over to the wall, pressing my ear against it. The scratching moved. It traveled across the wall, away from where I was listening, then up toward the ceiling. I followed it with my eyes, watching a spot on the plaster like I might be able to see through to whatever was making the noise. It reached the ceiling and stopped. I told myself it was mice. Old houses have mice, especially houses that had been occupied by an elderly woman who probably wasn't up to sealing every crack and gap. Mice in the walls were normal, nothing to worry about. But mice don't scratch in patterns, and this was a pattern I realized. 3 scratches, then a pause. 3 more scratches, another pause. Over and over, methodical and deliberate. I went to bed around 11, telling myself I'd deal with the mouse problem in the morning, maybe call a pest control company. The bedroom was at the back of the house, overlooking the barn and the woods beyond. I closed the curtains and changed into sleep clothes and got under the covers, leaving one lamp on because I didn't want to be in complete darkness. I was almost asleep when I heard it, scratching directly above me, on the ceiling. Same pattern as before, 3 scratches, then a pause, moving across the plaster. I opened my eyes and stared up at the ceiling. In the lamplight I could see it. Fresh scratches, thin lines appearing in the white paint, forming marks that looked deliberate like letters or symbols. My heart was racing, my body locked in place, unable to move. The scratches continued, carving through the paint, exposing darker plaster underneath. They formed words, I realized. Rough, uneven words scratched directly into the ceiling above my bed. Get out. I didn't think. I just moved, rolling out of bed and grabbing my shoes and my keys and running for the front door. I didn't grab my bag, didn't take the time to gather my things. I just ran. The car was parked in the driveway maybe 30 feet from the house. I got in and started the engine and reversed down the gravel road faster than was safe, my headlights bouncing wildly as the car lurched over ruts. I didn't stop until I reached the paved road at the bottom of the mountain. Then I pulled over and sat there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I never went back to the house. I had everything handled through the lawyer, had the property cleaned out, had my belongings shipped to me, listed it for sale. It took 8 months to find a buyer, and I sold it for less than it was worth just to be done with it. The buyer was a young couple from Ohio, looking for a quiet place to retire early. I thought about warning them, about telling them what I'd seen. But what would I say? That something was living in the walls, something that could scratch words into ceilings. They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am. But 6 months after the sale, I got a call from the lawyer. The couple who'd bought the house wanted to know if there was any way to dissolve the sale to get their money back. They'd only lived there 2 months. The lawyer said they wouldn't explain why. They just kept saying they couldn't stay there, that the house wasn't safe. I told him I didn't know anything that would help them. I told him the sale was final. I haven't heard anything since. But sometimes, late at night in my new apartment 3 states away, I'll hear scratching in the walls. Just faint, just for a moment. And I have to remind myself that old buildings make noise, that I'm imagining things. Usually I can convince myself. Usually. Story 7. I'm Vincent Murphy, and I was 43 when my car broke down on Route 476 in Knott County. It was late October, already dark, and I'd been driving back from a job interview in Hazard. The temperature was dropping, probably down to the 30s, and I was wearing a light jacket that wasn't going to cut it if I had to spend the night in my car. The car had just died, engine cutting out without warning, coasting to a stop on the shoulder. I tried to restart it 6 times, but nothing happened. Not even a clicking sound, just dead. My phone had no service. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, hoping another car would come by, but the road was empty. Route 476 wasn't exactly a major highway, more of a connector between small towns, and at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night, I guess most people were already where they needed to be. I decided to walk. There had to be a house somewhere nearby. Someone with a phone, or at least some idea where the nearest tow truck was. I grabbed my phone and my wallet and started walking back the way I'd come, using my phone's flashlight to see the road ahead. The pavement was cracked and uneven, weeds growing through the gaps. Trees pressed close on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked what little moonlight there was. I walked for maybe 15 minutes before I saw the light. It was off to the left, through the trees, a yellow glow that looked like it might be a porch light or a window. I left the road and pushed through the undergrowth, heading toward it. The light belonged to a small house, single story, set back from the road in a clearing. There was a pickup truck parked out front, older model, but it looked functional. I felt a wave of relief. Someone was home, someone who could help. I walked up to the front door and knocked. The man who answered was probably in his 60s, tall and thin, wearing work clothes that looked like they'd seen better days. He smiled when he saw me, friendly enough, and asked what I needed. I explained about my car, about being stranded. He listened and nodded and said he didn't have a phone, never saw the need for one, but he could drive me to the gas station in Hindman, maybe 10 miles away. They'd have a phone there and probably the number for a tow service. I thanked him, genuinely grateful, and followed him to his truck. We drove in silence for the first few minutes, the headlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating curves in the road. I tried to make conversation, asked him how long he'd lived in the area. He said all his life, said his family had been in Knott County for generations. He was telling me about the property lines, about where his land ended and the national forest began, when he pointed off to the left, toward the tree line. That trail there leads up to the old fire tower, he said. Haven't been up there in years. I looked where he was pointing, following the line of his arm. That's when I noticed it. His elbow was bending the wrong way. Not dramatically, not in a way that screamed impossibility. Just slightly off, like his arm had one too many joints and the elbow bent backward at an angle that wasn't quite right. He lowered his arm, and I tried to convince myself I'd seen it wrong, that it was just the darkness and the angle and my tired brain playing tricks. But then he turned to look at me, and in the dashboard light I saw his neck. It twisted too far. His head rotated to face me while his shoulders stayed pointed forward, turning maybe 200 degrees, smooth and continuous, like his spine was mounted on a bearing. My breath caught in my throat. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of the truck, but we were doing 45 miles per hour on a dark mountain road, and jumping seemed like a good way to die. "You okay?" he asked, his head still turned that impossible angle, his eyes fixed on me. I nodded, not trusting my voice. He smiled, and that's when I saw his teeth. Too many of them, I thought, or maybe the wrong shape. Something about his mouth wasn't right, wasn't human. "We're almost there," he said, and turned his head back forward, the movement smooth and awful. I sat frozen, my hand on the door handle, trying to figure out what to do. The truck was slowing down, pulling off onto a side road I hadn't seen. We were heading away from town, away from the gas station, deeper into the woods. "This isn't the right way," I said, my voice shaking. "Shortcut," he said. The road got rougher, more like a trail than an actual road. Tree branches scraped against the sides of the truck. We were climbing, I realized, heading up into the mountains. "Let me out," I said. He didn't respond. Just kept driving, that same pleasant expression on his face. I made a decision. I grabbed the door handle and pushed, throwing myself out of the moving truck. I hit the ground hard, rolling, pain shooting through my shoulder and hip. The truck's brake lights flared red, and it came to a stop maybe 20 feet ahead. I didn't wait to see if he'd get out. I scrambled to my feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush, heading downhill toward where I thought the main road might be. Behind me, I heard the truck door open, heard footsteps, but I didn't look back. I ran for maybe 10 minutes before I reached the pavement. Route 476, empty and dark, but solid and real beneath my feet. I turned left, heading back toward where I'd left my car, running in the middle of the road because I didn't want to be near the trees. A car came around the curve ahead, headlights blinding. I waved my arms and it slowed, pulling to a stop. The driver, a woman maybe in her 50s, rolled down her window and asked if I was okay. I told her I needed a ride. Told her my car had broken down. Didn't mention the man or the truck or anything that had happened. She told me to get in, and I did, sitting in her passenger seat and shaking while she drove me to the gas station in Hindman. The attendant at the station called a tow truck for me and let me wait inside, where it was warm and bright and safe. The tow truck arrived around 11 and drove me back to my car. It started on the first try. The driver looked at me confused, asked if I was sure it had been dead. I said yes, I was sure, but I didn't argue. I just paid him and drove home, glancing in my rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see headlights following me. I never took Route 476 again. When I need to go to Hazard, I take the long way, the one that adds 40 minutes to the drive. People ask why sometimes, and I just say I prefer the scenery. I got the job, incidentally. The one I'd interviewed for, but I turned it down. Told them I'd decided to stay closer to home, didn't want the commute. They understood. And sometimes, late at night when I'm driving alone, I'll see someone hitchhiking on the side of the road. I never stop. I don't care how cold it is or how far from town they are. I just keep driving. A story 8. My brother Owen and I drove out to our father's farm 3 weeks after the funeral. Neither of us wanted the property, but someone had to clear it out, decide what to keep and what to sell. I'm Claire Dashiell, and I was 38 at the time. Owen was 41. Our father had lived alone on that farm for 20 years, ever since our mother passed. It was in Bell County, tucked into a valley at the edge of the National Forest. 15 acres of rough land that he'd used mainly for keeping a few chickens and goats. He'd never been particularly social, never remarried, never left the property except for necessities. The house was in decent shape, but the barn was falling apart. Owen and I decided to start with the barn, get the worst of it out of the way first. If we had to tear it down, we'd need to know sooner rather than later. The barn was maybe 80 feet from the house, a 2-story structure with a hay loft on top and space for animals below. Our father had stopped keeping livestock in there years ago, as far as we knew. The doors were chained shut with a padlock that looked new, which seemed odd. Why would he lock an empty barn? Owen had the keys from our father's effects. He unlocked the chain and pulled the doors open, and we both stood there looking into the darkness inside. The smell hit us first. Not rot exactly, but something organic and wrong, like old meat left in the sun. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and mouth, and Owen did the same. "Jesus," Owen said. "What was he keeping in here?" We stepped inside, letting our eyes adjust. The ground floor was mostly empty, just some old hay bales and rusted equipment in the corners. But there were scratches on the walls, deep gouges in the wood that ran from floor to ceiling. Dozens of them, hundreds maybe, overlapping and crisscrossed. "Did he have a bear in here?" I asked, trying to make sense of it. Owen walked over to one of the walls and ran his hand over the scratches. "These aren't old," he said. "The wood's still fresh underneath." We looked at each other, both thinking the same thing. Our father had died 3 weeks ago. These marks were recent, very recent. The ladder to the hay loft was in the back corner, old wood that creaked under weight but seemed stable. Owen went up first, and I heard him stop halfway up the ladder. "Claire," he said, "you need to see this." I climbed up behind him, and when my head cleared the loft floor, I saw what he was looking at. Skulls. Dozens of them arranged in a perfect spiral on the hay loft floor. Small skulls, probably raccoons and possums and other animals. They'd been cleaned, bleached white, and placed with careful precision, each one positioned exactly right to form the spiral pattern. In the center of the spiral was a larger skull. Dog, maybe, or coyote. And written on the bone in something dark, I didn't want to think about what was a single word. Stay. Owen and I stood there staring at it, trying to understand what we were seeing. Dad did this, I said, but I didn't believe it even as I said it. I don't know, Owen said. That's when we heard the sound from below. Movement, something large shifting in the corner where the old hay bales were stacked. We both froze. I looked at Owen and he looked back at me, and neither of us said anything. The sound came again, closer now. Whatever was making it was moving toward the ladder. Owen started climbing down, moving fast, and I followed. We hit the ground floor and saw it at the same time. Something pale was pulling itself out from behind the hay bales. I saw a shoulder, too wide, the joint wrong. I saw an arm, too long, fingers dragging across the dirt floor. I saw a head starting to emerge, hairless and the wrong shape. We ran. We didn't talk about it, didn't confirm what we'd seen with each other. We just ran back to the house, and Owen grabbed his keys and we got in his truck and left. We drove all the way back to Lexington, 2 hours of complete silence, neither of us willing to say out loud what we'd seen in that barn. The next day, Owen called the sheriff's department, told them there was something dangerous on our father's property, that someone needed to check it out. They said they'd send a deputy. The deputy called back 6 hours later, said he'd been to the property, checked the barn, said there was nothing there, no sign of animals or people, no spiral of skulls, nothing dangerous. He suggested maybe we'd been stressed, dealing with grief, seeing things that weren't there. Owen argued with him, insisted that we'd seen what we'd seen. The deputy was patient but firm. There was nothing at the property. If we wanted to pursue it further, we could come out with him and show him what we were talking about. We didn't go back. We hired a service to clear out the property, sold everything through an estate sale company, listed the land with a realtor. We never set foot on that farm again. The property sold within a month to a developer who planned to subdivide and build houses. I thought about warning them, but what would I say? That something was living in the barn, something that our father had apparently been trying to contain. They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I am. But 2 years later, the development project was abandoned. No explanation given, no houses built. The land just sits there, empty and overgrown, with the barn still standing at the edge of the valley. I've driven past it once, couldn't help myself. I wanted to see if the barn was still there, if maybe they'd torn it down. It was standing. The doors were open, I noticed. The chain and padlock were gone. I didn't stop. I just kept driving, and I've never been back. Story 9. I'm Nathan Rivers, and I was 32 when I decided I needed a week alone in the woods. I'd been going through a rough time, divorce finalized, job stressful, just feeling like I needed space to think. I'd done solo camping before, knew how to handle myself, so I packed my gear and drove out to the Daniel Boone National Forest with a rough idea of where I wanted to set up. I found a spot about 4 miles from the nearest trail marker, deep enough that I wouldn't see day hikers, but not so remote that I couldn't hike out if something went wrong. The clearing was small, maybe 20 feet across, surrounded by old-growth trees that had to be 200 years old. There was a stream nearby, water running clear over smooth rocks. I set up camp in the afternoon, got my tent staked and my gear organized, and a fire ring built from stones I gathered from the stream. By the time I had everything ready, the sun was dropping below the tree line, and the temperature was starting to fall. I cooked dinner over the fire, rice and beans from a foil packet, and sat there watching the flames while night settled in around me. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't felt in months. No phone, no email, no one asking me to do anything. Just trees and fire and silence. The first night was fine. I slept well, woke up to sunlight filtering through the tent, spent the day hiking and reading and just existing without pressure. I saw a fox in the afternoon, this beautiful red thing that paused to look at me before disappearing into the undergrowth. I felt good, felt like I'd made the right decision coming out here. The second night was when I started to feel watched. It's hard to describe that sensation. There's no logic to it, no specific thing you can point to. You just know, somewhere deep in your brain, that you're not alone, that something is paying attention to you. I was sitting by the fire around 8 o'clock when the feeling hit. I looked around the clearing, trying to see what had triggered it, but there was nothing. Just darkness beyond the firelight, just trees and shadows. I told myself I was being paranoid, that being alone in the woods was messing with my head, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing over my shoulder, kept scanning the tree line looking for movement. Nothing. I went to bed around 10, crawling into my tent and zipping it closed. I lay there in my sleeping bag, listening to the forest. Insects, wind in the trees, the stream bubbling in the distance. Normal sounds. Then I heard the footsteps. They were circling my tent, slow and deliberate, crunching through leaves and twigs. I held my breath, listening, trying to identify what kind of animal would move like that. Bear, maybe, deer. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent, maybe 3 feet from where I was lying. I waited, not moving, barely breathing. After a minute, the footsteps resumed, continuing their circle. Around and around my tent, maybe a dozen times before they finally moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there listening, waiting for the footsteps to come back. They didn't. The third night, I decided I was leaving in the morning. Something about the place felt wrong now, and I'd learned to trust that instinct. One more night, then I'd hike out at first light. I built the fire bigger than I needed, stacking on extra wood, keeping the flames high. The light pushed back the darkness maybe 15 feet, and I sat with my back to a tree, watching the perimeter. Around 9, I saw it. Just a glimpse, just for a second. Something pale moving between the trees, staying just beyond the firelight. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, moving in a way that didn't look quite right. Too smooth, too fluid, like it was gliding instead of walking. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward where I'd seen the movement. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and undergrowth. Nothing. I swept the light back and forth, searching, my heart pounding. The forest was empty. Whatever I'd seen was gone, or it had moved. I kept the flashlight on, holding it in one hand while I fed the fire with the other. I wasn't going to sleep. I was just going to wait for dawn, then pack up and leave. The hours crawled by. Midnight, 1, 2. The fire started dying, and I kept adding wood, refusing to let it go out. Around 3 in the morning, I felt pressure on the tent behind me. I was leaning against it, using it for back support while I sat by the fire. And something on the other side of the tent fabric was pressing inward, pushing against my back. I scrambled forward away from the tent, spinning around to look at it. There was a handprint in the fabric pressing inward, the material stretched tight around 5 fingers, but there was no one there. I could see through the gaps in the tent's ventilation, could see the empty space beyond. The handprint stayed for maybe 5 seconds, then slowly released, the fabric returning to its normal shape. I stood there, staring at my tent, my entire body shaking. I left everything. The tent, the sleeping bag, the camping stove, all my gear. I grabbed my flashlight and my car keys from the tent's vestibule, and I started hiking. It was dark, pitch black away from the fire, and I was moving through unfamiliar terrain with just a flashlight. I fell twice, scraped my hands and knees, but I kept moving. I had to get away from that clearing, away from whatever was out there. I reached my car around 5 in the morning, just as dawn was starting to break. I got in and locked the doors and sat there, breathing hard, waiting for my hands to stop shaking enough to drive. I never went back for my gear. Lost probably $800 worth of equipment, but I didn't care. I couldn't make myself go back into those woods. A week later, I called the ranger station and told them I'd abandoned camping gear in the forest, gave them the rough coordinates. They said they'd send someone to retrieve it. They called back 3 days later, said they'd found my campsite, found the fire ring and some evidence of a tent, but no gear. Nothing. Like someone had packed it all up and carried it away. I told them that didn't make sense, that I'd left everything there. They said they'd keep looking, but they never called back. Sometimes I wonder who or what took my gear, whether something packed up my campsite after I left, whether it carried away my tent and sleeping bag and stove. And sometimes, late at night, I think about that handprint pressing through the fabric. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't moved. I wonder what was standing on the other side of that tent, reaching out to touch me. I try not to think about it too much, but sometimes I can't help it. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, hit that like button and subscribe for more. Let me know in the comments which story unsettled you most, and share this with your friends who love a good scare. Until next time, stay safe out there.